Hello, I am Erin Ramos, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about multiculturalism and intercultural communications, especially as it pertains to within an organization. Now, a lot of what is going to be said here in this video is common sense, but often we find that common sense isn't that common, and so it still bears repeating. Now, a little bit about myself and my cultural background. I am from the United States. I am an Army brat. I grew up all over the place. I was originally born in Arkansas. I lived in Hawaii. I've lived in Texas. I spent 3.5 years in Germany. And currently I live in Maryland on the east coast of the U.S. Now, I was fortunate enough to experience my father's command, which was very unusual in that the soldiers under his command were not U.S. soldiers, but rather were from around the world. During the bulk of his command, the majority of those soldiers were from Israel and Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. There were quite a few from the Ivory Coast and South Korea, Japan. So it was a very, very interesting experience. I learned a lot. So I've had a lot of experience with multiculturalism and international cultures, and some of the pitfalls that can come about from not understanding what is going on when you are introduced to a new culture. Some of the cultures that we might come across within an organization, it includes obviously those international cultures. If someone from a different country may do things in a very different way than you do, and it's important to be aware of that and to be sensitive to that. There's also inter-socioeconomic cultures that you might experience. We're all familiar with redneck jokes. You might be a redneck if you do something a certain way. Some people may identify with that and be all about, oh yeah, it's totally how we do things. I'm obviously a redneck. And other people might be absolutely horrified by some of the stuff that they hear. And that is another instance of different cultures. Even if you're from the same country, you still may have those different reactions, different interactions with people from different way of life from what you're used to. We also get intergenerational cultures. For the first time in history, we have 4 generations in the workforce. You've got the veterans who are from the Second World War and have a very individualistic idea of how to do things and tend to be very conservative in their way of going about doing things. We've also got the baby boomers who tend to have a lot of optimism and start moving into what we consider the teamwork, the team player aspect of the business world today. Then we've got the Gen Xers who are our latchkey kids, the ones who grew up being very independent, but end up seeking the work-life balance that they noticed their own parents, the baby boomers, did not seem to have. And then we get into my generation, the Gen Yers, or the millennials, as some people call us. Many people consider us to be very entitled or spoiled. We grew up with the internet. We, like the Gen Xers, we seek that work-life balance. We want to be able to have fun with the money that we make while we're at work. With these different generations, we now have to come into this idea of communicating differently with different people. Now, we all know that our grandparents don't do things the same way that we do them. Our parents don't even do things the same way that we do. Often you hear the joke of, oh my God, I'm ending up just like my mother, and it's kind of an idea of being horrified by this idea of ending up just like your parents. But in the workforce and in your organization, it's important that each generation within your organization understands how the other generations work and how you can all work together to come about with better, more dynamic outcomes within your projects, within your organization. It's also important that each generation understands how to communicate with the other generations. Millennials really require and desire a lot of feedback. They want to know how they're doing pretty much every moment. We want to know when we're doing something wrong before it becomes a huge deal. Meanwhile, someone who's a veteran or a baby boomer might actually feel a little bit resentful if they're constantly getting feedback. They feel like they're constantly being watched. They're going to feel like they are, they're under somebody's thumb maybe if you're constantly giving them feedback. And in that instance, you really do have to understand how to communicate with those different generational cultures so that you don't end up creating an environment of resentment and frustration within your workforce. Now, what are some of the problems that you may experience as you're dealing with different cultures within your organization, maybe even dealing with other organizations? Probably the most obvious one is that of language. In some cases, this might include foreign languages. People don't speak the same language. You're not going to really be able to communicate. And there's a very common case study within the business education world that's often quoted as an object lesson in what not to do as you move into an international market. So the Chevrolet Nova was put out by Chevrolet from 1962 through 1979, and it was included in the American market, and it was also sold throughout South America, and especially in Venezuela and Mexico. In the English language, Nova is this idea of a star going nova. You've got lots of energy, lots of excitement. It's a big deal. It's very cool. And it's often quoted that when Chevrolet tried to move into a Spanish-speaking nation to sell their car, it didn't sell well, and nobody really understood why. And then it was finally figured out that in Spanish, nova looks like the Spanish phrase no va, which translates literally to doesn't go, which is kind of disastrous when you're trying to sell a car, something that is supposed to go. Turns out, though, this isn't actually a true story. So you can look it up on Snopes. It's more of a cautionary tale along the same lines of, George Washington and the cherry tree. It's a good story, but it didn't actually happen. In fact, the Nova sold very well in Spanish-speaking markets. But still, it's a good object lesson and why it's important to understand different languages and how it can really ruin your business if you don't have someone that can explain something like this to you. Another version of the language barrier is that of slang. If you go to an American who goes to London and asks for a biscuit is not going to get the that little bread roll type of thing that we like to eat for breakfast. Instead, they're going to hand you a cookie, and an American is going to be a little bit confused by that, unless of course they already know. And going back to the intergenerational idea of different cultures, this also deals with the slang that comes up from different generations. I still very distinctly remember my father asking me back in the 90s when I was in middle school, Aaron, what does all that mean? I don't understand it. And and I would go around, I'd see something that I thought was cool, and I'd be like, oh man, that is just all that in a bag of chips. And I knew exactly what I was talking about, and I had a really hard time explaining to my dad what it meant, because all that meant it was all that. But eventually I did get the point across. It means awesome. But slang is something that's important to understand. Now, one of the other issues that you may come across that you're going to have to deal with within your organization as you move into an international market, especially, is that of the legal issues that can come up. In the country that you're moving into, is the law system, is it based on a cultural law, a common law, or is it more civil based? Is it written down hard and fast? Here in the U.S., we have kind of a mix of the two. We have some very hard and fast laws that we follow, but we also have some common laws. Certain laws are really based more on precedent. What did past judges and the judicial branch decide on in terms of interpretation of the law versus, what's actually written down. There's a story a couple years ago, I remember reading about a couple in Dubai who were making out on the beach and ended up being arrested because that kind of public display of affection is illegal. You're not allowed to do that. And here in the U.S. or in a lot of Western cultures in the Western world, you wouldn't think twice about making out on the beach. It's romantic. It's a great location. And we have all these reasons on why that's okay to do, but in other cultures, it's really not. And then they even have their legal system set up to back that up, that idea that it's not okay and you cannot do that. So it's very important as you're moving into an international setting that you understand just what you're going to be getting into within the legal system. You also need to think about whether or not the culture that you're going to be dealing with is individualistic or if it is collectivist. Here in the U.S., we are very individualistic, and you can see that reflected in our media, in our movies. Think about Die Hard or really any major action flick where you've got this one hero type person who is set up to deal with all these problems over here and will overcome all obstacles and manage to come out on top in the end, and they're our hero. And the idea of the hero is very, very individualistic in its nature. In other cultures, it's more collectivist. It's more community oriented. It's you can get into this in there's some South American cultures and also in Asian cultures where it's assumed that people tend to think alike, or if you're going to do something, it's going to be for the good of the community, not because it's what's good for you. You might actually give up something that would be good for you in favor of what's going to help out the community as a whole. So, if you're dealing with someone who's from that kind of culture and you're not used to it, you may have a hard time understanding why they're going to sacrifice something that could really benefit them in order to help somebody else. And it's just one more consideration that you have to think about when dealing with these different cultures. Another major thing to think about is whether or not someone is coming from an explicit rule culture versus an implicit rule culture. Do they expect all the rules to be written down, bullet pointed, and organized real nice and easy to understand, or are the rules expected to be kind of implied? You're going to walk into a situation, look around, see how things are going, and then just kind of pick up on what the rules are supposed to be and follow along. If you're expecting to have all your rules written out for you and you walk into an implicit ruled culture, you may have a hard time adapting as you're expecting, you'll do something a certain way and then turns out that that's offensive to somebody, or it's very wrong and you're going to clear out a room because now nobody likes you. And you might get upset because, nobody told me that I can't do this that way. But it's expected within that culture that you're gonna observe your surroundings and you're gonna pick up on what is and is not expected of you. And so it's very important to be aware of that and to be sensitive to that and to think about. You really have to use your critical thinking skills to be able to adapt to that kind of situation. And one of the other issues that you're going to have to deal with as you move into an international market is the levels of uncertainty that the people you are going to be working with are willing to handle, are willing to accept. Here in the U.S., maybe you come up with some great new plan and you bring it to your manager, to your supervisor, and you tell them, I think this is going to work, and this is how I think it's going to work, and they decide based on what you presented that, hey, this is a great idea. Let's go ahead and give it a try. We'll see if it works, and if it doesn't, no harm, no foul. We'll find something else that does work. And that's generally very expected here in the U.S. We're a very risk-taking society, and we really don't have a whole lot of issues with something that's not that's not super certain. Go to Egypt, on the other hand, and in that same scenario, you're going to have your supervisor go like, "Whoa, slow down there, slugger. Let's break down the data and see how this is going to actually work, and let's run some simulations and go for some models, and let's get all of our facts together and really see what all the possibilities and alternatives are, and let's be really sure that this is going to work the way we expect it to work before we actually put it in place." Someone from the U.S. might go into that kind of situation, get really frustrated because, gosh darn it, I know it's going to work, and if it doesn't, we'll just try something else, and that's how we do it. But that doesn't always work in every culture. You've got to be sensitive. Again, we come back to that idea of sensitivity. You've got to be sensitive to what the people you're dealing with want, what they are comfortable with. And in this particular situation, they need more assurance, more reassurance for what they're doing before they're willing to take that extra step and really commit to something. Now, it's also important that you consider what this culture you're dealing with, what they think of when they are considering time. Now, time, you might think of it as something that's very straightforward. It's, if let's meet at 1 o'clock, we all get together at 1 o'clock. That's not necessarily how it works out, depending on the culture that you're going to go to. Now, as I said earlier, I'm an Army brat. I was raised with the idea that if you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late, and if you're late, well, then, you might as well not even show up, because at that point you're so late that you're basically screwed. So, when I go into work, I try to get there about 15 minutes early. When I go to class, I try to get there about 15 minutes early. It is an important part of my culture and my upbringing that punctuality is considered respectful of the people that you're meeting with. It shows that you value your time, and you value other people's time, and that's just part of the culture I grew up with. Now, my husband's family is Puerto Rican, and when we first met, we were teenagers, and for several years that I knew this family, one of my biggest pet peeves was very constant tardiness of the family. You tell them, like, oh, party is going to start at this time, and they show up an hour and a half late, and they don't think anything of it. There's no apologies or anything like that. That's just when they show up. And when you think about the way I was raised, if you're late, you might as well not even come. I viewed it as this family has no sense of respect for us. They don't value our time. They don't think that what we're doing here is important, and in a lot of ways I was very insulted by it. But I've also been studying Spanish for several years, and as it turns out, part of Puerto Rican culture is the idea of time being not as hard and fast as we here in the continental United States think of it. It's a much more nebulous idea. If you tell somebody that you want them to be there at 1, all it really means is that you want them to show up at some point after 1 o'clock. Come at 2, come at 2:30, come at 3. It doesn't actually mean show up at 1 o'clock on the dot, maybe even a few minutes early, so you're really sure you're going to be there on time. Since learning that particular fact about Puerto Rican culture, because it's not like I actually asked this, because you want to keep the peace. You don't ask stuff like that. Why are you always late? But since learning that, I've come to be a little bit more okay with the idea of this family always being late to stuff. And so now we deal with it. Like, oh, party is going to start at 8. Well, we'll tell them it's going to start at 7. They'll show up at 8:30, and we'll be good to go. So that is all some of the biggest problems that you can run into as you move into an international way of doing business is you take your business from something very local into something much more global or really even national. It's like I said before, you can, even within the same country, you can have different cultures. People on the East Coast of the United States do not do things the same way that people on the West Coast do them. And the North-South split at the Mason-Dixon line is kind of a almost cliched version of that. The Yankees don't do things the same way the Dixie Boys do. But in general, the three biggest pitfalls that you want to avoid are ethnocentrism. First of all, just because you were born within a certain culture does not necessarily mean that by default your culture is the best. A lot of people like to go around saying, like, we're number one, and it's really not true. You are one of many different cultures. And assuming that you're the best just because that's where you happen to get born, it's just the luck of the draw, really, is a really kind of conceited view of the world. So yeah, remember where you are is not necessarily the best. It's just one of a myriad options that are out there. Something else, don't stereotype. There are a lot of stereotypes out there, whether it's the dumb blonde or, the black people love watermelon or, all Asians are really good at math. Those are stereotypes that in some cases they're a positive stereotype, like Asians are good at math. In other cases, they're negative stereotypes, like the idea of being blonde automatically makes you dumb. Don't judge people based on those stereotypes. Such stereotypes do breed prejudice, and that leads to a whole host of other problems. Don't go in expecting someone to be a certain way just based on your stereotypes that you've got pictured in your mind, the way that you expect them to be. Whether it's a positive or a negative image, it can still negatively affect your relationship with that individual as you expect them to act a certain way, and then they come out and surprise you doing something completely different. Or, in some cases, it blinds you from seeing something that's really cool or really not cool just because you expect it to be a certain way, and you just refuse to see, you put your blinders on, and you refuse to see the other things that are happening that are going on around your expectations. And finally, try to avoid assumptions of similarity. There's a lot of this idea that's kind of popular right now of, we're all basically human. We all have the same basic needs. We all have the same basic wants and desires and stuff. And on a certain level that's true. But along with stereotyping, it can breed some negative issues. It can create some tension between different people. If you deny that there are differences, it also means that you deny the value and the really cool stuff that somebody can bring to the table just based on their background being different. Yes, we all need air, we all need water, we all need food, we all need shelter. But beyond that, there are a whole lot of other things that can be very different. We don't all need to be a hero in the United States, going back to the idea of Die Hard or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. We don't all need to be a hero, and that's not necessarily what's going to be driving somebody, and it's important that you don't assume that is what's going to be driving somebody's motivate. It's going to be somebody's motivating factor. And this also goes back to what I talked about earlier with time. I assumed that my in-laws were going to respect my time and my family's time and be on time and punctual, and because that I assume that for them that would be as much an indicator of respect as it is for us. turns out that was false, and it actually created a lot of tension and conflict between us that really didn't need to be there. So be aware of that. Don't assume things. Don't assume people are going to be the same. Don't assume they're going to be different. Try to approach a situation with as neutral of a set of expectations as you can. Just take things as you can. And finally, pay attention to your own perspective on things. Things aren't always going to be the way you expect them to be. And sometimes your perspective is going to be really skewed. And you're not necessarily going to notice that. It might take somebody pointing it out to you. Be sensitive to that when somebody says something like that. Try not to get defensive and go into this mode of like, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and this is how it is, and this is how I'm going to do it, whether you like it or not. You can be sensitive to how you are perceived by others, and also try to learn things firsthand. If you want to know about a different culture, the best way to learn about that culture is to go and immerse yourself in it. Go to that foreign country. Go to that different state. Hang out for as long as you can afford to do so, and really absorb it and learn about it, and find ways to relate to that culture. Obviously, you're not going to be able to learn everything all at once. You might study a certain culture for years on end, and then go find something that's going to surprise you. But much like people, cultures are very nuanced and have a lot of layers to them, and there's always going to be something new to learn. But don't let that stop you. Learning something is better than learning nothing. And finally, as you were learning about this different culture, learn about their rules. Be sensitive to their rules. They might not be spoken, but they're still there. That sensitivity, and I keep going back to this idea of sensitivity, is really the key to being able to communicate with someone within a different culture. Getting people together and creating something amazing is really based on the idea that you have to be sensitive to where they're coming from, what their perspective is, especially in comparison to your own perspective. And when you put it all together, you really have the potential to create something fantastic. And that's what makes dealing with all these different cultures the most satisfying. When you're able to get that fusion together, get everything combined, the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. So that is it for this particular discussion. Go learn something new today. Go read Wikipedia or about.com, or go watch a foreign film. Try to learn something new about a culture, and maybe try to find a pen pal and find a more first-hand way of learning. And enjoy the process, and remember, be sensitive. That's the key word here. Be sensitive to everything that's going on around you and the way the people around you react, whether they're from your own culture or not. So that is how you manage to get along. Thank you, and you guys have a wonderful day.